What's going on, guys? Mike Sabo here with Basket Case Garage, and today we are going to be assembling a Yamaha Banshee engine. Now, this will be a step-by-step process from start to finish, and at the end of this video, you will get to see this thing running, but there are a couple things that I want to note before we get started. First off, my name is Mike Sabo. I am not a certified technician. I didn't go to a trade school to learn how to do this stuff. All of my knowledge was gained through about 15 years of experience of building small engines and reading service manuals and also working with some of the best engine builders in the world. So at this point, I would consider myself a junior engine builder. I'm certainly not the best in the world, but I'm pretty damn good at what I do. So take that for what it's worth. I recommend that you use this video as a guideline to your own service manual or as a reference for any parts that you may be getting stuck on in your own personal builds. The other thing to note is that this engine in particular has quite a few modifications. This is a performance build for a Banshee that I call the Voodoo Banshee. It is a 350 stock bore, but we're going to be using some custom parts like CPI cylinders, which are a monoblock as opposed to two individual cylinders, which you might be working with. And there are other modifications on this thing as well, just something to take note. However, the general installation and assembly is still going to be relatively the same no matter what modifications you have done to your Banshee. Now, this is going to apply to all years of the Yamaha Banshee from 1987 all the way up to 2012. You could probably also use this as a reference for the RZ350 and the RD350, but don't quote me on that. So we've got our climber service manual right here. This is what we'll be referring to throughout this video. I've also got all of my assembly lubricants right here. I've got my cases and my transmission and my crank here, my shift forks and everything. So let's get started. All right, guys, we're gonna get started with the bottom end. We're gonna start with the shift forks and the shift drum and all that. In the top right corner, I will have the section of the climber service manual that you can refer to if you want to follow along. All right, so here is our shift drum. This will be going in first. If you want to replace this bearing right here, which I have replaced all of the bearings on my transmission, it's very easy to do. You can see this ring out here. Just take a tool and it spreads open like that. And then once you pull that off, the bearing will slide right off. You can slide your new one on there. One thing to note is that you want the side with the markings facing outward. You can see in there the label is on the outside. So if you do replace that, make sure that it's facing on the outside. And before I pop this in place, we're going to use our Maxima assembly lube. I'm just going to throw a little bit of lubricant in all of our grooves. This will slide right through the side. There we go, no problem. Of course, as you're installing your engine parts, you want to be inspecting everything. If you see anything that's messed up or needs to be replaced, you're going to want to take care of it. All right, so we're going to go ahead and put our shift shafts and the shift forks in. So these are the two shafts right here. You can see there's a shorter and a longer one. And there's a little groove at the end of each of these shafts. That's for this E-clip. So we can't put this on the outside. We have to do that in the case. And these are going to slide through the side of the engine. They are little holes right on the side there that these will slide through. I'm going to start with the shorter one. That one goes up front. I'm just going to put a little bit of lube here, a little bit on the shaft itself. And we're going to go in with the ridge facing forward. You can see that slides right in there. You want to make sure the stuff isn't bent or anything. A lot of times, in most cases, these are going to be used pieces that you're putting back together. Sometimes shift forks and shift shafts and things can actually be bent. Now, there's two different types of shift forks that we're going to be putting in the engine. So two of these are the same, and one of them is different. So you can see these are both numbered, number 1. Those are the same, and then this one has a number 2 on it. So you want to keep that in mind. We're going to be using one of the number 1 forks that's going to go on this side, and it's going to go in the middle groove of your shift drum. And you can see it has this little peg here. That's what fits into the groove of your shift drum. So we'll go ahead and line that up and then just slide the shaft right into place. That's what she said. And we'll kind of hang that right there. Then we'll take our E-clip and put it in place. Came around the other side of the engine so that hopefully I'm not blocking anything. Sometimes these can be stubborn because your shaft is going to want to rotate. There we go. And you want to make sure that it's clipped all the way in. The last thing you want is for that thing to pop out after you get the engine together and the engine is actually running. Then we can push that shaft into place. Now for the top shift forks, they're going to go like this, 1 and 2. You can see how they're numbered in this order, and again, making sure that the pegs are facing towards your shift drum, and they're going to be in the 2 grooves on the outside like so. So we're going to start with our number 1. Slide our shaft in here. This one was a little bit snug pulling it out, but once it gets going in there, it smooths out. So here is our number 1. Get that in the correct groove. Slide the shift fork or shaft in, and just make sure everything is nice and smooth and lining up. And this is the number 2. Slides in place, no problem. Okay, all right, then we'll take our E-clip and again just clip this in place. I think I got it. Now we're on the side of the engine. This is the side of our shift drum, and these are the ends of our shift forks, or shift shafts rather. And you can see this is a retention plate. This is going to hold that assembly in place. Now this has 2 functions. For one, it's going to hold the shift drum in place. You can see how this moves. There's a groove around this. You're going to be careful. You don't want to push it all the way in and put the plate on top, because you could install it like that and then the rest of the assembly won't go together. You want to pull this out so that that groove is going to line up with your plate. This will go like so. It's going to hold shift drum in place, and it's also going to hold the end of that shift shaft in place. So this plate actually has 2 functions, and we're going to be using these flathead screws. If you're using your OEM equipment, these are going to be a JIS screwdriver head. It's different than a Phillips, just slightly. Sometimes you can get away with a Phillips head, but that does sometimes jimmy them up, so you got to be really careful. Now these are aftermarket screws and they're not JIS, so I don't need to use a JIS screwdriver, but I did want to mention that. And I did put a dab of blue Loctite on these. Go ahead and get this in place. And I'm just going to snug these. And while we're here, we might as well put the shift star in place. So you're going to have a pin that goes in a little hole in the bottom. Now a lot of times when you pull apart an engine, or when somebody else does, this pin stays in the drum. So if you're looking for the pin, look in the drum. It might actually still be in there, but that pin goes in place just like so. And then we have the shift star right here, and you can see it's got a hole in it. That's for that alignment pin. Now this shift star is a little bit different than a regular shift star. Yours may look like this though, because it's a very common mod. So if you see this one is nice and pointed, typically these are all going to be pointed, with the exception of this one right here. This is neutral. This is what's called the shift star mod, and rounding out those points makes shifting on the Yamaha Banshee a lot easier. Now if you're looking for how to do this mod, I do have a video on that and I will link to it. However, if you don't feel like doing the mod and you just want to buy one of these stars, you can buy them and they're relatively cheap. I'll have that linked in the description below as well. It's pretty hard to put this on in the wrong orientation. Once you have that pin in there, and then you have a D-shaped portion that goes in the center, so it kind of can't be lined up incorrectly. And now we've got a washer for a countersunk screw, and then a countersunk screw. And then on this, we're also going to be using just a little bit of blue Loctite. Now there's also a plate that prevents this shift shaft from coming out, but we're going to do that later on in the video. All right, now that the forks and the drum are in there, just go ahead and roll this. Make sure everything is nice and smooth. All right, now we're getting ready to put these case halves together. I'm going to be doing it a little bit differently than how the manual tells you to do it. We're going to be using Yamaha Bond 6B. The service manual will tell you Yamaha Bond 4. Both of them are great. This is just a high temperature version. Either one of those will work though. And the way that I like to do it is by putting the case sealer on right now before we put any of our components in. That's going to make it a lot easier. When you have all these studs and stuff in here sticking out, it can be really difficult getting your finger in here. And you can use a brush. That'll work too, but I think this is really the easiest way and the best way to get the best coverage with your gasket sealant. The thing is that you just want to make sure that you have all your stuff prepared so that you can get stuff together nice and smoothly and quickly, because this stuff will cure, it says 7 minutes, it loses its tack on the back. Realistically, as long as you're within 15 minutes, there have been times I've gone like 20, 25 minutes and it still works out just fine. But realistically, if you can stay underneath 10 minutes by the time you get everything together, you should be good to go. That's what you want to shoot for. Under 5 minutes would be even better. So to prepare for this, to make sure everything goes nice and smooth, I've got 2 brand new dowels. I've already got anti-seize on them. I've got our top case bolts. They're anti-seized as well. I've got the washer slid on there. We've got the bottom. These are these nice 12-point nuts from BP Racing, but they're ready to rock and roll for the bottom. And then we've got our case studs right here, and you can see I've anti-seized those as well. Now, if you're gonna follow the service manual, they actually want you to red Loctite these into the case. I like to use anti-seize, makes removal really easy, and I've never had a problem with them backing out. I've also got 2 nuts handy because we're gonna use these to tighten down a couple of these studs. And then moving over to the crank and the transmission, I have our new seals right here in place, and I've got our countershaft collar. You just wanna make sure everything is out and ready to go. We're going to grease the inner lip of these seals beforehand, and put this one in place on the transmission, and we'll put our crank seals in place on the crank. And then we also got these bearing stays. These slide in the case. We've got one small one for the transmission, a large one for the transmission, and then one for the crankshaft. You just want to make sure they're there and ready to go so you have them to drop in place. All right, so we'll go ahead and grease our seals. This is the transmission seal. You just want to get some waterproof grease and just pack the seal. Now before we put the seal on, we're going to put our collar in place. This is for the countershaft. Now this is an aluminum one, but it's going to be no different than the steel one in terms of how big it is. This is just a lightweight one. You can pick these up from Mac Daddy Racing if you do want to save a little bit of weight. So that will slide right there on the transmission. Then we'll take our seal with the manufacturer markings on the outside and just gently slide that in place. Now to get the seals in place on our crankshaft, we're going to have to put our primary drive gear in place. The way that these go, on the inside, you've got these kind of standoffs. They face inward towards the crank. So we'll go ahead and grease this. So we'll go together like this, just nice and easy. You want to make sure you don't roll the lip of that seal. All right, now you've got a shaft key that goes in here before you put your primary drive gear in place, and you want to put a little bit of sealant around your shaft key. This is a notorious spot where Banshees will leak. I actually already applied my sealant on there. You guys can probably see it. And I forgot to press record on my camera, so you guys get the idea though. You just want to make sure that you have sealant around that key, and then you want to get it on top also. Now here's the primary drive gear with the seal facing in the correct direction. And sometimes this is a press fit, but with these hot rods cranks, they usually slide in place. Just want to make sure that it's lined up with that key, and it should slide right into place. Yep. Boom, no problem. And this seal can go back and forth. You want to put it up against that crank bearing. Now moving to the other side, same thing. We'll pack this seal with some waterproof bearing grease. And again, placing it with the letters on the outside. And then this side with those little kind of blocks inside, that faces inside. This will just slide in place. Boom, no problem. Now something I want to note before we go any further, on this crankshaft, you can see there are O-rings on these bearings, and typically on these hot rods ones, there's another O-ring in this center groove right here. However, mine actually got pinched off doing test fitment. Now you can get away with that. Those O-rings keep these things from spinning in the cases, so they can actually run without that. But to take place of that O-ring, you can replace the O-ring, or you can put a couple dabs of silicone around the outside of this thing or in the cases, and that'll hold that in place. So that's what we're going to be doing. And I'll just show you guys on another crank here. This is a Driveline Performance. You can see this one has 4 O-rings. So depending on what kind of crank you have, you might have a different setup there. But if there's O-rings missing, you can sometimes get away by just putting a little bit of silicone on there. All right, we're ready to rock and roll here. We're going to get these cases coated up with our sealant. Now I've already prepared these cases. I did a light surfacing on them, cleaned out all of my threaded areas and stuff. So these are ready to rock and roll. I do have a video showing where I do all that stuff, but you want to make sure that these case halves are good to go. You don't have anything, you know, sticking up, and you want to make sure they're nice and clean too. If you have oil all over these surfaces and stuff, it's your gasket material is not going to adhere. Okay guys, so I have my gasket sealant in place. Unfortunately, my camera did not record the entire scene, but you can see I've got all the gasket material on there. I like to lay it on in a thin coat and then dab it with my finger, and then that kind of gives it like a little bit of a thicker coating. I like to do both halves here, and I do like to put it in where all of the seals go. That's not in the service manual, but I like to do it that way, and I usually don't have leaks. Now as for the studs, I already started putting these in. The 2 outside ones are going to be the longest, and then the rest of them are all the same size. Now these BP Racing studs are really nice because they actually have an Allen head, and it makes it really easy for putting these in. And these do not need to be tight. I'm just going to thread these all in by hand. I have one dowel that goes right here, and I might as well put the other dowel back here, like so. And I can go around, just give them a little snug. Now coming over to the case portion, we'll put in our main shaft and make sure it lines up with your fork. Pops into place like so. Now we've got our bearing clips. Make sure these are in place. Put our counter shaft in. Again, make sure your shift forks are lined up. And that should pop right in place. I'm going to make sure that it clips in. There we go. And now we'll take our crank and put it in place. We'll make sure all of our seals are lined up in the grooves. Otherwise, when it comes time to clamping these cases down, it'll crush them into the wrong position. You want to take your time when you do this. Don't want to force anything. All right, now we're going to torque these bottom nuts. These go to 18 foot-pounds. You want to start on the inside and work your way out, going in a crisscross pattern. And then I like to do 2 passes just to double check. And it's really important that you hold your torque wrench out here and not in here, because where you hold it can actually change the amount of torque that you're putting on these nuts. Now I'll put the top bolts in place. And there's really no special technique that I use for finding which one of these go where. Basically, I just place them all in, and you want them all sticking out about the same amount. And that's how you know you got them in the right holes. These go to 7.2 or 7.4 foot-pounds. I'm going to go to 8 because this torque wrench does not have increments as small as that. Same thing, going in a crisscross pattern. And we'll go ahead and make sure that the crank rolls nice and free. It's okay if there's a little bit of resistance. A lot of times new crank seals, they squeeze on the crank really tight, but you do want to make sure it's nice and smooth. You'll be able to feel if it's binding too tight. Looks like that seal came out just a little bit, but we were able to push it back in place. It looks good. Then make sure we spin nice and freely on both sides, and I think we're good to go. Now, if you need to continue along with your engine build ASAP, working with a rag and some lacquer thinner will wipe away the gasket material, but it's kind of messy and it can smear and stuff and be a little time consuming. If you have time to wait a couple hours for this stuff to cure, you can kind of scratch it away really with your fingernail, and it comes off really clean and easy. The only thing is you do have to wait for it to cure, so maybe do it before lunch break or something, but it really is way easier to just scratch it off like that. All right, now we're gonna move to the top of the engine and put our clutch actuation arm in. We've got a brand new seal here. I've already gone ahead, packed it with grease. And these usually can just press into place like so. Now we're actually gonna pull this bolt out. Now we've got our clutch actuation arm and we've got a spring. The spring goes on here. You can see it hooks like so. Then we've got a washer that goes on here. Then we're gonna put this in like so. It'll drop into place. Might be a little snug at the seal. Just wanna make sure you don't roll the lip there. And then you wanna take your spring and fit it over like that. Make sure that moves nice and free. And then we'll take our retention plate, goes on top, drop our bolt back in place, and torque that back to 8 foot-pounds. A couple last steps here, and then we can call the bottom end done. I want to put on our bearing stopper plate. This goes right here. I like to do this and the next piece we're going to do right now because it's easy to forget this stuff. We're just going to put a drop of blue Loctite on all of these screws. And this has a sharp edge and a rounded edge. I like to leave the rounded edge facing upwards. And these just get snugged down. They don't need to be crazy tight. This next piece is this little shield. A lot of people forget to put this in, or they think it's unnecessary and they don't put it back. You can see these 2 channels right here. That's for oil flow. And when this is in place, the way that the gears go, they actually splash and direct oil up and into here, and then it goes into your gears. So you can run the engine just fine without this. You may never even have problems, but it's likely that you'll have premature transmission wear if you don't put this back in place. It's super lightweight. All it takes is putting it in place, and that's going to help with the oil flow. So don't forget to put this in. Now's the time when you want to do it. Same thing, a little bit of blue Loctite on these. And the very last piece that I want to put in place is this little clutch cable stay. We're not going to tighten this down because when we get the cable, we're putting the cable in, we're going to have to loosen this up anyways, but I just want to get it in place so that we know where it is and we don't misplace it. Okay, center cases are done. The next thing we're going to move into is the external shift mechanism and shift shaft. So this is the area we'll be working in. Before we do anything, I'm going to spin the engine around and we're going to put a new seal in for our shift shaft. New seal is going to go right in here. I'm going to make sure that this is packed with grease before you put it in. I just like to put those in until it's nice and flush. With this one, I think you can actually bottom it out, and it's pretty much right there. All right, let's get started with our shift detent. Now, you're going to notice a couple of mods here, some differences that you may have if you're working with an OEM setup. The first one I already mentioned was the rounded shift star. Now, the shift detent that we're installing, you can see there's a roller bearing on it. If you have your OEM setup, there's a flat piece of steel on here. It's a round piece of flat steel instead of a bearing. This is a nice upgrade though, and it does pair nicely with the rounded shift star. Then we've got a spring that goes behind it. You've got a catch on the one side, and then this is the stop that will keep this in place, and that's going to go in the case right here. And you can see there's a little ramped portion here. It's actually going to help us install this thing. When I put this together, you're going to face it this way, hook that like so. And then we've got a little shoulder bolt, and I do put a little bit of blue Loctite on these things. We'll put the shoulder bolt in there. All right, now we'll place this thing in here as a unit, and we'll get the thread started. You want to make sure you're not cross-threading this because we're actually going to walk it in. You want to make sure this little spring catch is on the ramped portion of the case. A flathead screwdriver definitely comes in handy here for, getting everything in place. We're just going to walk this thing in. You want to make sure it's nice and smooth and you're not cross-threaded, like I said. And this, the bearing, or if you have the flat piece of steel, you want to make sure that's in your groove up here of the shift star. And just make sure it's still nice and smooth. And this should walk right into place. Using a driver like this is a good idea because you can't get much torque on these things. So if you don't have it lined up properly, you're more likely to stop before you damage anything. But we're in place right there, and I believe everything, just want to make sure it moves nice and free. So that's good to go. And then I'll come in with the wrench and just snug it like so. In here, this is the end of our shift fork shaft. Now, to stop that from backing out, this plate will actually go in place right here and prevent that from backing out. And it's also going to serve as a lock washer once we have this jam nut down. Now, if you look on this adjustment nut, you'll see it's uneven. You see how it's flat? Oh man, it's flat on the bottom portion, and on the top it's kind of sticking out. And if I roll this, it changes. So it's kind of like a cam, and that's an adjustment. So this can be a scary piece to install, but it's really not difficult. So I like to thread this in as far as it goes, and then we will slide our washer on there and spin this in place. This is a piece that I recommend putting a new one in if you're ever going to get into your engine and do some building, specifically because they're notorious for wearing down. You can see the wear marks on the one that I'm taking out. That's just going to make it a little bit more difficult to get it adjusted properly. It's a cheap piece to replace, so if you're going to be building the motor, it's a good idea to have one of these things on order, and then even if you don't need it, it's just good to have it there so you don't have to stop and wait for more parts. Now we'll put our shift shaft in place. There's one more shift mod that I want to show you guys. On this shift, this is called the shift window. I've opened it up just slightly. Typically, these portions would be straight, and this little bulge that I have there, that wouldn't be there. Now what that does is when the shifter is attached to the other side, when you shift up and down, it's making the shift shaft do that. Now with those windows opened up, it makes it so that you can shift you can push the shifter down a little bit further in each direction, and it just helps with shifting on the Banshee. So that's a nice mod right there. I do have a video showing how to do that. I will link to that if you guys want to check that out and do the modification yourself. Put a little bit of assembly lube on here. Another mod guys will do is they'll open this up a little bit, and they'll actually put a roller pin bearing in here, and that's supposed to make your shifting even smoother. This should pop right in place. Okay, so now we can adjust this little shift adjustment screw here. What you want to do before you do this is get your transmission in any gear but neutral. Now, the way you can tell if it's in neutral is, it's actually easier without the shift shaft here. So I'm going to pull this off just to show you. See our detent right here? If we were in neutral, this piece right here, the one with the little cutout, that would be right on top of this bearing. So you want to make sure that as long as it's not right here, you're good to go. So the way that this is, we're going to be able to adjust it just fine. Now while we spin this adjustment bolt right here, what we're looking to adjust is the gap right here in between this piece of the shift fork or shift shaft and then the peg on the shift star. If we come down here, you can see there's a big gap on the bottom, and then up top it's touching. Now if we come in here and spin the cam, you can see it's starting to move. And right about there, it looks like we've got about an even gap on top and on the bottom. And then we're going to come in and we'll jam our lock nut. And locking this is very easy. We're going to hold it with a screwdriver and then tighten up our jam nut. And then of course, after you tighten it down, you want to make sure that your adjustment is still in spec. We can remove the shift shaft and then fold over our lock washer. Put the shift shaft back in place. Looks good. Now this can be a little bit cumbersome to do, but you can bench test this. I put the shifter on the other side. We're going to spin the main shaft here and just make sure that you can shift into each gear. Well, this is cumbersome because as you just saw right there, the shift shaft wants to pop off. That won't happen once your cases are together and everything. But you just want to make sure that you can get into all of the gears. All right, now we're going to do our Kickstarter. I have mine broken down just in case yours is as well. You got your shaft right here, and then you've got your gear. This has a little spring stay on the back. Then you've got your collar and your return spring right here. First thing we'll do is spin our gear in place. This little catch can move. Now on our shaft we have a stopper right here, and this is where that stopper portion will go, and then the little spring catch goes right here in the cases. So we will just line those up and get that like so. Now we have a return spring. You can see there's a little stay right here. There's a tiny little hole in the shaft, and what you want to do is slip that in place like so. Usually your return spring is going to be hanging around in this portion because you can swing this around and put it like so, and that's there'd be a little bit too much tension on the spring, so we'll put it in like that. And we've got a collar, and it's got a little opening here that's going to clip onto our spring and hold it in place like that. Then we'll take a needle nose, grab onto our return spring, and just spring it up and put it right here on this little post. There's a little groove that keeps that in place. Now we're going to put the idler gear in place. We've got a very thin washer that's going to go on first. Then we've got the idler gear itself. I've already got a little bit of lube on there. It should spin nice and freely. Then we've got a washer with a D cutout that will go right on top like so. And then we've got a C-clip. This is going to go on top. I do recommend putting a new one of these on every time you do this. I'm going to make sure this is set in the groove. There we go. Now you can throw your Kickstarter on and check for proper function. You want to make sure to hold this collar nice and tight. Looks like it works good. If you don't hold this collar, the little stay on the back of this gear will pop out of place. The case is normally, the clutch cover normally holds this in place. You just have to do it with your finger. All right, now we're going to go ahead and put our clutch assembly in. We've got our push rod. Put a little bit of lube on there. That just gets dropped in place like so. We've got our little ball. Goes on the end, same thing, put a little bit of lube on that. Now we're going to be working with two washers here. They are both the same. One goes on like so. Then we've got a collar or spacer. This is going to go right in place, if it will let me. There we go. We've got our clutch basket. This is an aftermarket billet basket by Chariot. This will slide right over top of that collar. It's going to have to fit into your primary drive gear, and then the idler gear on the other side, you might have to spin it, and then you can see like that, drops into place. Then our next big thick washer Goes right in place like that. The next we have our inner hub. You want to check to make sure it's not grooved out too bad. There are very minimal grooves in this, but they're smooth to the touch. This one's still got plenty of life left. Slide that in place, line it up with the splines. Now we've got a 32mm nut that goes on here, and there is a lock washer that goes in place here. However, I don't like using those things. I do recommend that you use them. I just never have any problems when I put red Loctite on here. They never back off. So I put a good amount of this on here, and don't worry, I will be able to remove this when the time comes. But anyways, go ahead and spin this in place. Then we'll use our clutch holder tool. This thing is a godsend, man. Highly recommend having one of these things if you're working on engines. It's such a cheap tool, it's just worth it to have. That's going to hold the inner hub in place. And we're going to go to 66 foot-pounds. There we go. This does not need to be tight. You can actually crush this inner hub if this is too tight. It's just meant to go in those teeth and hold on from spinning. I'm going to skip ahead to the primary drive gear and the water pump gear. The primary drive gear we already slid on there. Now we've got the water pump gear. That just slides into place like so. And we've got a dishwasher, if you guys can see, or a spring washer. That will go with the dish portion like this, if that makes sense. Put that in place. I like to red Loctite this as well. Spin our nut on. And this is a regular thread. Sometimes these are left-hand threaded, depending on what you're working on, not on a Banshee though. And we're gonna use the penny trick or the soft nail. This is an aluminum nail. You wanna use a soft material. And we're just gonna jam that in the gear. And that will prevent the gear from spinning as we're tightening it down. It's like a 24mm socket with our torque wrench, and we're gonna go to 47 foot-pounds. Good. Now don't forget to roll this back and pull out the soft nail. Sometimes they get stuck in there, but you don't want to leave that behind. Now we're about to do the clutch pack, so we're going to start to introduce oil into the system. So I'm going to plug up the cases. I've got this pretty trick aluminum magnetized drain plug. I'll have these linked in the description below. Got a new crush washer on there. That'll spin right into place. This doesn't need to be tight. Just snug it. And I'm going to put a little bit of tape over top of this just to try to protect that anodized finish as we're moving around on the bench here. Okay, now we're going to put the clutch pack in. I already have my fibers pre-soaked, so it's a good idea to put these things in a plastic bag and just soak them in whatever kind of transmission oil you're planning on running. This is an aftermarket clutch, so you may see some differences here. First off, if you're using an entirely OEM setup, you're going to have what's called cushion springs, or sometimes they're called judder springs, and they're very thin washers that go on the inside here. You can completely disregard this if you have an aftermarket clutch setup. Now, the other thing you'll notice is that you'll have what's called a half plate, and you can see the thickness. This is a traditional plate right here. The thickness will be about half of this, and the first plate that goes in is going to be one of those. So again, if you've got an aftermarket clutch, 99.9% of cases with Banshees, you can just completely disregard that. You're not going to see that. So we're going to start with a fiber and put this in place. Next, we're going to go with a steel. Some differences that you may see with the steel are that it may be dimpled. That's a different style of plate. And then there's a smooth plate like these. And you're going to have a sharp edge and a rounded edge. Some people like to put all the sharp edges down or all the rounded edges down. Honestly, it really doesn't make a difference. I'm kind of anal like that, so I'm going to put the rounded edge down on all of these. But really, if you flip-flop them, it's not going to make a difference. We'll go with a fiber again. You're just going to alternate back and forth. And something I forgot to mention before too, with your clutch basket, if you've got excessive grooving in these clutch fingers, it's time to replace it. Now I wanted to show you guys an example of a dimpled clutch plate. You can see the tiny little dimples in there. And then the top of this plate also has a little depression in this piece right here. Now if you do have plates that are this style, if you come up here, you'll see on your inner hub or your clutch boss, there is a little dot here. Sometimes it's an arrow, sometimes it's a dot. You want to line that plate up with that bump right on the dot, and then you're going to stagger each plate that you put on there. You want to stagger them by 60 degrees and just keep doing that as you're putting them on. A little confusing, but I did want to mention that because this is another style of clutch plate. Now we're going to install our clutch pusher. Now this is not the OEM clutch pusher. This is an aftermarket one. This is what's called the Pancake bearing mod. So if you look at mine, you'll see there's a Pancake bearing in between a set of flat washers in here. And then you have the nut on top, and here is our free play adjustment screw. Now if you've got the OEM one, when you push this through your pressure plate, there will be a washer on top, and then your nut goes on, and it stays together. So what's nice about this aftermarket system is it can be pushed through, and you know, it doesn't have to be attached. So depending on which aftermarket one you have, it may be slightly different. This one, as you can see how it goes together, it's the actual clutch pusher itself, one washer, Pancake bearing, another washer, and then you have your nut and your adjustment screw in there. This is a jam nut on here, and then it literally just pushes right through. So I'm gonna go ahead and put our clutch pusher in there. Now we're gonna put the pressure plate on, and you'll notice there are 3 arrows on the pressure plate. You wanna make sure that one of those is lined up with either your dot or your arrow, whichever your inner boss has on there. If you put it the wrong way, I'll show you what happens. You put this on, and you can see there's a gap between your top fiber and the pressure plate. And now if we line it up properly, you can see that gap goes away. It's nice and flush and right up against that top fiber. Now we're gonna put our clutch springs in place. If you're going with a regular clutch setup, if you're gonna stop right here, you put your springs in, and then you put your bolts on, and they get tightened down to 7.4 pounds of torque. I would go to 8 foot-pounds, and you just tighten up in a crisscross pattern. Now, we're doing a modified clutch here. This is what's called a lockup. This is the direct drive setup, where it has weights that actually swing out with centrifugal force. So I'm gonna show you how this one goes on there. I'm also going to be doing some staggered springs here. So I have some OEM springs right here. These are some old school, new old stock ones with the yellow paint on there. And then I've got these heavy duty springs right here. You can see they're a little bit longer. These are about 10% heavier than stock. So I'm gonna mix them by staggering them, and that's gonna give me just a tiny little bit more of clutch grab. We might even be able to get away with doing all OEM here, but this is going to be fine. We'll still have a fairly easy clutch pull. Then we have our direct drive lockup, and this is literally going to go right on top of the springs. And I've got these trick looking bolts here. These are titanium. Now the trick to getting this in place without damaging anything is by getting them all started and then bringing them down little by little in a crisscross pattern. And now you want to make sure if you're doing a lockup to have these folded in as you're coming down, because what will happen is they'll get locked in this position like that. They need to be held up. I'm going to put the aluminum nail back in our gear just for a moment. We don't need much holding pressure here. We're going to tighten these down to 8 foot-pounds. Boom. Got to be really gentle with these because it's really easy to snap off that inner portion that these are adhered to. We're just going to go in a crisscross pattern. And then just make sure all of your fingers move nice and freely. You didn't lock any of them in place. Now with this little Phillips head right here, you can adjust the clutch free play. You would loosen up your jam nut, and then by screwing this in or out, that's going to adjust your free play. That's something I like to do not on the bench, you know, once the engine is actually in the quad itself. So I'm not going to do that right now. There are videos out there that show how to adjust this. If I can find one, I'll link to it. And we're getting ready to put our clutch cover on. So there's a couple last steps here. We've got a cylinder dowel that's going to go back here. Put a little anti-seize on there. Pop that in place. And then this hole right here, we've got a coolant tube that goes through there. There's a little retaining clip that's going to hold it on the one side, and then we've got an O-ring as well. Now this is another one of those items, if it looks worn or kind of beat up, especially in this area, you might want to go ahead and replace it because it can cause really tiny leaks and just get coolant into your clutch side of the engine and stuff. It's just not worth it. This is pretty cheap to replace. I think these are like 13 bucks brand new from Rocky Mountain ATV. So it will slide in place like so. Then we've got this little ring that goes in place. And that'll snap in that groove like so. Just make sure that it's seated all the way around, and that's going to prevent this from backing out. And then for the O-ring, Just put a little bit of dielectric grease on these. That's going to help seal and also lubricate it a little bit, make it a little bit easier to get inside of our clutch cover case. Just pop that right in that groove. Now if you're using an aftermarket O-ring, you need to make sure it's the correct thickness because it will get sheared off when you're putting the clutch cover on. This is an OEM one that I ordered right from Yamaha. Now I've got a brand new Cometic clutch gasket here. These are really nice. There's a type of foam on them, and then there is a thin, actually, piece of aluminum in here. These are really nice gaskets. I don't know that I would really need to grease this. You could probably pop this right in place and you'll never have any issues with it. However, I like to grease my gaskets because it makes taking them off a breeze. So I just take regular bearing grease and just simply put it all over the contact area of the gasket. And that's just going to help. It has a sealing effect, and then also when it comes to teardown, it just makes the gaskets peel right off because it is such a pain in the ass getting stuck gasket material off of an engine case. All right, we'll take our gasket and put it in place. Any excess grease is not going to hurt anything at all. And of course, before you put this on, you want to make sure all of your case surfaces, mating surfaces are good and clean. If there's any gouges or anything, you might want to surface them. Now we got this sweet ass lockup clutch cover. Got that lime green Lexan on there, titanium hardware. This thing is freaking sweet, man. Now we're gonna do a little bit of work to this thing before we can put it in place. First off, I did put a new water pump seal and water pump bearing in. You can see they are nice and greased. You want to make sure they're nice and packed with grease. The inner seal lips are both packed with grease as well. Now we're gonna put our impeller in. This may look different than yours. This is a billet aftermarket impeller. This is supposed to have a higher volume. Definitely recommend picking one of these things up. We're gonna go ahead, slide that into our water pump bearing, or seal rather. Just make sure you ease it in there. You don't wanna roll the lip of the seal. Once it pops in there, you'll be good to go. Boom. This bearing may pop out on you. It depends what kind of case you have. But sometimes, like this one, the bearing just slides in very gently. Now if this impeller is snug, that's normal, especially if you have a new seal in there. Now you've got a little pin that's gonna go right through here. And then you have the impeller gear. You can see how this has a collar on one end, and this little plus portion, that's what this little pin fits into. So we're gonna face this down and onto here. Now this is a plastic gear. If yours is billet, it may have been upgraded at some point. That is a common mod. We've got a washer that will go right on top, and then an E-clip. It's time to get this thing in place. This thing is going to look freaking sweet. You want to make sure everything is nice and lined up. Don't force this in place. You don't want to shear that little O-ring that we just put on for our coolant tube up here. So just nice and easy. And everything should pop into place. You might have to spin your water pump gear to get those teeth to line up. These all just get a dab of anti-seize. Your hardware may be different than mine. These are actually titanium bolts that I'm using for a little bit of weight savings. Now I'm going to run these into place with this Milwaukee. This has torque settings on the top of it. I'm going to put it on number 1, which goes to about between 5 and 10 foot-pounds of torque. It's almost nothing. And I'm just using these to speed up the job and get everything at least close. And then we will be tightening these down. If you're going to torque them, the manual only suggests about 6 foot-pounds. These things really don't need a lot of torque. I'm just going to snug them up by hand because I've got a good feel for these things. And you do want to do these in a crisscross pattern. Now we'll put our water pump cover on. Same thing with as with our other gaskets. Just going to grease this thing up. This is one of those gaskets where you really want to do this because the water pump cover sometimes kind of gets seized into place. And that thing, it can be a nightmare getting the old gasket off. So this one, definitely want to get it nice and greasy. That'll stick it in place real nice. We've got some more aftermarket stuff here. This cover is made of billet aluminum. The OEM one is going to be steel, and what else is nice about this one is it's got a little drain bolt right here. The OEM one, there is no drain bolt. The only way to drain it is either by pulling the cover off entirely, or you just pull your hose off and, you know, coolant kind of spills all over the place. So this is a nice upgrade. If you're using OEM hardware, it's going to be a Phillips or a JIS screw. And these are all getting just a little bit of anti-seize. I'm just going to snug these up. If you want to torque them, they go to about 6 foot-pounds. Throw our trick little CNC dipstick in place. All right, let's move over to the stator side. So here's our stator plate. This will be going in place like so. And you'll notice these holes are slightly elongated. That's because this is a modified stator plate so that you can advance the timing just slightly. I do have a video showing how to do that, and I will link to that below. However, we're not going to be using this stator plate. I just wanted to show this for reference. That is an OEM stator plate. We're actually going to be using this Swiss cheese one right here. You can see I did quite a bit of weight reduction to this thing. Again, this build that I'm doing is all about weight reduction. And what you can see on this one too is these have very elongated holes. This can go up to plus 10 degrees in timing, which is what I want for this particular build. Just wanted to show you that OEM one though, just so that you don't get too confused. You can purchase these aftermarket stator plates as well without all of the holes. I'll have those linked in the description below. Now we're going to assemble the stator on the bench before we install it onto the engine. So we can start by feeding the wires through the back like that, and then this will screw into place. Got 3 screws here. Use our JIS screwdriver. Just snug these down. Now on the back side, we've got our pickup that will wrap around right like this. Got a screw on either side, and these are adjustable back and forth. We'll be adjusting them in a moment here. So I'm just going to lightly put these on here. And then on this side, there's one stay right here. And then another stay right here. The first thing I want to do is feed the wires through this little hole right here. It's easy enough to do. Usually I'll put one plug through, and then the other 2 will follow. And we'll just pull this up on through. And the grommet will usually just pop into place, no problem. You want to make sure it's seated in there real good so you don't get water into your stator housing. And now from here, you can get the stator in place. You can take the slack out of that grommet. And there it is, man. It fits right into place like so. And as you can see, this is how you would adjust the timing, by spinning it like this. Now these fasteners, I like to put just a dot of blue Loctite on them. And now your amount of degrees would be the equivalent to where the cases meet. So you can see that would be 0. You can go all the way down to -10, or you can go, in this case, this will go to about plus 14. And I'm just going to snug these down. Now I'm going to be tuning this engine once it's in the frame, so I'm not actually leaving the timing as high as it is right now. In most cases with a Banshee, you're going to stay below plus 4 degrees of timing, but it's all going to depend on your mods and what fuel you're running, so make sure you do your research before you set your timing. But for your traditional stator plate, where you don't even have any adjustments at all, you don't even have to worry about this, it's just a matter of putting it in place. Right now we're going to put the flywheel key in place. I like to put a little bit of anti-seize on these, because sometimes they like to get seized in place. When it comes time to take it off, it can be a real pain in the ass. So we're going to go ahead and place this in our groove here. And you want it to be parallel with your shaft. You don't want it to be in line with the taper of the shaft. You want it kind of like that. Then we'll slide our flywheel in place. We'll put a little bit of red Loctite on here. Then we're going to put our nut on here. This one might look a little bit crazy because this is a titanium lightweight nut. Now sometimes I'll just blast this on with an impact gun, but since we've got the tools, we'll put our clutch holder in place, or a flywheel holder actually. It's a multi-use tool. Then we'll come in here and we're going to tighten this down. The service manual says 59 foot-pounds of torque. There we go. Now we can adjust the gap between our pickup. You can see here's the pickup on the flywheel, and then as it passes through here, that tiny little gap there is what we want to adjust. This can move forward and backward. Now, an old school trick is making it about the thickness of a business card. Now, before we put our stator cover on, we're gonna go ahead and do the sprocket and case saver. If you're doing this on the bench, I would recommend that you do this after you put it in the frame. It makes it a little bit cumbersome, especially if you're gonna use the case saver that I'm about to show you guys. It just kind of makes it big and bulky and kind of difficult to get into the frame. So I wanted to complete the engine on the bench just for purposes of showing you the process. First thing we're gonna put in is our shift drum cover. So this is the back side of our shift drum right here. You're gonna have an O-ring on the back. You wanna make sure the O-ring is in good shape. If you can, definitely replace it. I like to put a little bit of either grease or dielectric grease on there because that just kind of helps it slide into place. And you want to kind of ease it into position. Last thing you want to do is shear that off and have a leak here. So just kind of take your time and it'll pop into place. Now, if you're not running a case saver, there's 3 countersunk bolts that are going to go in there. However, we're running this DRW case saver, and most case savers for the Banshee are going to hook up in the same spot. You can see the 3 mounting holes right here. They're going to match up right here. The bolts go through this and then also mount up that plate. So if you haven't seen one of these before, it's probably looking pretty crazy. This is a DRW case saver. I run these on every single machine. If it's available for the machine I'm doing, I'm getting a DRW. These things are notorious for stopping case failures. The way that they fit on here, it fits the form of the case. So even if it's not bolted in place, it doesn't want to go anyplace, and that's what really prevents it from damaging the case if you break a chain. It won't bunch up inside here because of how form-fitting this is. Before we put that on though, throw our sprocket in place. I've got a 15 tooth that I'm going to be using, and then you've got a locking washer. I recommend putting a new one of those on, but these can be reused. Then I've got a lightweight billet sprocket nut. This is from Mac Daddy Racing. Saves you a little bit of weight and rotational mass. I'll have these linked below. And I don't tighten this up until it's in the frame with the chain on there, so it's got something holding it from spinning. All right, now we can install our case saver. We've got hardware that is supplied by DRW. I did put a little bit of anti-seize on these. These just get snugged down. Oh yeah, check out this sweet brand new stator cover. This is compliments of BP Racing ATV. They saw the old Grody one I was working with and they said, man, you can't build that engine without a new stator cover. So if you're looking to pick one of these things up, they do carry them. This is brand new OEM. If you're planning to use one of these with the DRW case saver, there's a section of this case cover that you need to remove. I've already cut mine down. This is the cutoff piece right here. So I just cut that down with the Sawzall, smoothed it out with a cookie wheel, and that looks really good. We've got our gasket right here. I've got a little bit of dielectric grease on it. I'm just gonna rub it around the edges. This helps keep the rubber in good shape, last a little bit longer, not dry out, and it also has a sealing effect. And I have cut mine down a little bit to stop right here because I have case damage, and there's actually a portion of case that's usually right here. However, mine cracked off long before I even bought this thing, and I've trimmed mine down. This gasket I'm gonna put in place on the cover first. It kind of like clips in place. There's a groove, and the cover fits into it, holds it in place. Put our new stainless steel hardware in place. All of this stuff gets a little bit of anti-seize, and I just snug these down by hand. If you do want to torque them, you can go to about 6 foot-pounds. Then I like to come in with a rag and just wipe off any excess dielectric grease, because that's going to be a dirt grabber. Okay, so we're gonna set up our pistons. The first thing we wanna do before we do that is check our ring gap. So essentially what we're doing is checking the gap between these 2 rings when they're compressed in the cylinder. So first and foremost, take one of these rings with you wanna have the marking facing upward, just as a rule of thumb with piston rings, pretty much in every case. We'll put that in there. You can see they're not laying even. You know, you could just like press it down with your finger and stuff, but the right way to do it is to take your piston, because you want that ring to be nice and even when you take your measurements. You do that, you're gonna come up from the bottom, and when you push up, it's gonna make it nice and level, and you'll get an accurate measurement. Now, as another rule of thumb, you typically want about 4 thousandths per inch of bore in diameter. So you really don't need to be super precise with this. unless you're doing like, you know, super racing stuff. But I mean, you can literally use just a regular ruler here, get the approximate. These are almost exactly 2.5 inches, it looks like. Or if you want to get anal like I am, we will come in here with a pair of calipers. You can measure the exact bore. Wow. It really is like exactly almost 2.5 inches. But anyways, so we have, if it was a 2-inch bore, that'd be 8 thousandths. So 3-inch bore would be 12 thousandths. We'll come back down to 2.5 inches. That would be 10 thousandths is what we're looking for in this tiny little gap right here. So we're gonna take our feeler gauge. We'll find 10 thousandths. And this is really, you just wanna make sure you have at least 10 thousandths. If it's tighter than this 10 thousandths or whatever you know it is for your bore size, you're gonna wanna shave a little bit out. We're good to go. That fits nice, that fits in between there almost with no drag. So that's probably got like 11 or 12 thousandths. Perfectly okay. The important thing is that it's not too tight, because with these ring ends, what's happening when the engine heats up, they're gonna expand and they're gonna get tighter and tighter. And if your ring gap isn't large enough, it'll start to, they'll butt up against each other and they start to deform, and that can cause premature engine wear, and it can actually cause catastrophic engine failure. This is a super easy step. Definitely want to do this before you put your pistons in. Make sure you check all of your rings. Now we'll ring up our pistons. So these are Wiseco pistons, and you've got 2 pins. They're called locating pins, 1 and 2, and that is where your ring end will go. And again, you want to make sure that marking is facing upward. For these pistons, the top and lower ring are both the same, so you can't mix them up. What I like to do is get that one end started and just kind of walk them in place. I'm going to try not to scratch up the top of your piston. If you do, it's not the end of the world. And just kind of slowly get her in there. Nice and easy. And then you just line it up with that locating pin. Same thing with the top, making sure that logo is up top. Walk her in place. Easy. Now the other thing I like to do with my pistons before I put them on the connecting rod is I take one of these circlips and I'll put it on the inside. What I mean by the inside is, so your piston arrow is here, so the piston's going to be facing this way. Now if we take our other piston and put it next to it, since this is a twin, both of these are going to be inside, these ones are going to be outside. So these inside ones are going to be a little bit more difficult to get to. So I'll do these on the bench, and then you can slide your wrist pin in from this side, it'll butt up against that, and then you only have to do the outside one. It just makes it a little bit easier. You don't have to do this. And the other thing, it's another rule of thumb kind of deal, is you want the opening of your wrist pin clip facing either upwards or completely downwards. You don't want it sideways. In smaller bore stuff that reaches really high RPMs, believe it or not, this is super rare. I don't know that I've ever seen it happen, but apparently, especially with like 85s, 65s, really small engines that get super high RPMs, from the force of the engine rotating so fast, these can actually compress and fall out. I shit you not, man. So just as a rule of thumb, you want the openings facing upward or downward, and then that won't happen. So we'll go ahead. Oh, geez. All right, let's try that again. This can be a little difficult doing it in front of the camera. Usually I have this resting up against the bench. You might want to put on some safety goggles when you're doing this, because I have had these things literally fly out and hit me right in the eye, and it's just not good. So goggles, eye protection is a good thing. We get it in the bottom groove also. There we go. Just make sure that that is nice and seated. The last thing you want is for that thing to pop out. And you can see I've got it in the 12 o'clock position. This one is good to go. All right, let's get our pistons in place here. It's a good idea to stuff your cylinders so that if you drop that wrist pin clip, you're not digging through the engine, because, you know, if you have to tear this thing down just for that clip, you're gonna hate yourself. So we'll go ahead, put our wrist pin bearing in place. I'm gonna put, this is just 2-stroke oil, it's Beanol. I like to use this as my assembly lube for the top end. Just fit that in the rod, roll it around. There's a little hole in the top, lubrication hole. Make sure got plenty of lube in there. You can't use too much. Now we're put a piston in place. I have to say this, there's the arrow that means face forward. I've seen people put them in the wrong way. If there's no arrow, usually these little piston ports are gonna be facing towards the intake or the back of the engine. So we'll just place this right here. You wanna make sure that you grab your piston with the clip on the inside. Just line that up, slide your piston pin in, boom, easy. All right, let's see if we can get this ring in. See, that would have gone right into the crank. And if you can't get it out with a magnet, could be a problem. There we go. All right, we're clipped in place. And if for whatever reason you're not at, the top or bottom with that opening, you can take the screwdriver and push it. Sometimes it's really tight, but you can spin them. All right, almost time to put our cylinders on. I'm gonna go ahead and put the base gasket in place. Just like with my other gaskets, I like to grease these up. Again, this is not a 100% necessary step. It's just something that's gonna make it easier when it comes time to rebuild. And again, this grease is not gonna hurt anything. If you have some excess that gets into the cylinders, it's just gonna burn off as soon as you fire it up. And this is a one-piece gasket. You might be working with 2 separate base gaskets. If you're doing any kind of Cub stuff or CPI cylinders, you usually have a one-piece gasket like this. And you may notice also that my cases look a little bit different. That's because I did some port matching on these, but the same procedure will go if you have everything stock or whatever your setup is. All right, we're ready to put our cylinders in place. You want to make sure that your ring end gaps are lined up on the piston pins. One more time. And I'm going to set this with one piston higher than the other one because the cylinders we're using are a mono block. So you may have 2 separate cylinders. If you're using any kind of like CPI cylinders or anything, they're gonna be like this where it's one piece, and it can be a little bit more cumbersome to get in place, but I think it's easier if you do one piston at a time. You throw a little bit of 2-stroke oil on both of the pistons. And just kind of run it around the piston, make sure it's coated. Now we're gonna do the same thing with our cylinders. Get a nice thin film of oil all over the bore. All right, let's see how we do here. If it's not obvious, the exhaust ports go forward. These monoblocks definitely take a little bit more finesse than doing 2 separate cylinders. You just want to make sure you're taking your time with them. And then they do eventually slide into place, no problem. Make sure it's seated on all of your dowels. If you have to, you can use rubber mallet. This one looks like it's seated nice and even. All right, now we'll put our base nuts in place. I'm gonna be using these little 10 points. These are pretty trick because they're really small. If you use the OEM nuts here, you're gonna go and you're gonna need a 12mm wrench. Whereas with these, you can get the job done with a 10mm because they're such a tight profile. And getting in on these Banshee cylinders is a real pain in the ass. So the bigger the wrench you have, the harder it's gonna be. If you can use a 10mm, it's just better. Especially these ones in here, they're just really tight. And then these base nuts will get tightened down to 20 foot-pounds. You can snug them down by hand first and then come down and torque them. This is definitely a little bit easier if it's in the frame, but 20 pounds isn't so much that the engine's gonna be spinning around. You typically wanna go in a crisscross pattern. I'm just gonna start by getting these back ones tightened down because they're easy to get to. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I've got a pretty good feel for these things, so I usually don't use a torque wrench on these, but since this is a tutorial video, I'll do it the right way. And we've got this Motion Pro tool. This will hold any, really any hand wrench that you can fit in there. And then it's got the attachment, so you can clip that right into your torque wrench. Now, as long as you keep it at a 90-degree angle, you'll get an accurate torque reading. Once you start going at weird angles and stuff, you're changing the torque reading because you're changing the length of the wrench, and that's gonna change the leverage. So we're gonna keep it at a 90-degree there. We're gonna start in the center with these pain-in-the-ass ones. Get her on there. And unfortunately, you lose your ratcheting mechanism when you do this because you have to keep it at that 90-degree angle. And we'll just keep going until we get that 20 pounds. All right, there we go. That one is tightened. Now we can go ahead and put our cylinder studs in place. I've got these really nice ones from BP Racing. They've got an Allen head in the top, so they're really easy to install and to remove. I've got a little bit of anti-seize on all of these. Just makes it easier for when it comes time to pull them out of here. These are all the same length, and to the best of my knowledge, there are no cylinder dowels that go in the front here. On these CPI cylinders, it looks like they have a recession for a cylinder dowel, but in the cool head, there's no spot for it. On the takeoff cylinders, there's no spot. Stock cylinders don't have it there, so just wanted to mention that because it does look like one goes there. Before you're putting these in, you actually want to make sure that your cylinder surface is nice and clean. If you have a surfacing stone, that's a good time to surface this and just make sure it's nice and flat. Now we can come in with our T-handle and bring these in, and these just get snugged up. They do not need to be super ultra tight. These Allen heads really make this so easy. If you have a stock stud or a non-Allen, you can use the double nut trick, but that just takes so much more time. Before I slide the cool head in place, I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize on the top of these studs for the cylinder head nuts. Now we're going to load up our cool head with our domes and our O-rings. If you're putting in different size domes, usually the size will be listed on the outside ring. It'll be stamped. It might be up top here. Sometimes it's up here. If you don't know what size domes you need or what the difference is in domes and how that changes your compression and stuff like that, you might want to do a little bit of research. But for purposes of this video, we're just going to assemble everything. So these will go in place. You'll notice there is a little divot right here. Most cool heads are going to be the same with domes. So this is a mod quad if you've got a Pro design. The Chariot is the same. Boss is going to be the same. I believe NOS as well. They all have this same style. If you have a Trinity style head, it's going to be a little bit different. If you got like an old school one or whatever. But anyways, you want to line that little thing up, that little locating pin. I guess you could call it a pin anyways, right there. So that will line up right like that, just like so. Before you put this in place though, there are two O-rings that go in here. What I like to do to keep these in place is take a little bit of grease and just dab it in a couple places. And this is not going to hurt anything. It's just good for keeping the O-ring in place. So I'm going to just put this down here. That grease holds it in place. Now with a lot of these, it's a really snug fit and they actually need to be pressed in place. You can do it in a bench vise. Just want to make sure you have something soft in there so they don't damage anything. Make sure this is lined up, and then it's really something you want to be careful with. You don't want to force anything and cause any damage to any of your stuff. So make sure that you're lined up with your locator. And just come in nice and easy. And you can see it's pressing right into place. You don't want to force it. If for some reason it doesn't want to go in, you may not have your locator lined up. But right there, that looks good. Now we'll do the same thing for our other O-rings and just put little dabs of grease in all of these little recessions for the O-rings, just so that they don't pop out. Then we'll lay our O-rings in place. The grease is an absolute must, or these O-rings will never stay in place. And you have to put the head upside down to put it on. So if you don't have this, there's just really no way to hold it from falling out. Come in here, wipe off the excess. Again, none of this is going to hurt anything. It'll just burn off as soon as you fire the engine up. But you can clean it up a little bit. All right, now we're going to put this in place, and you want to keep an eye on your O-rings. Just make sure that they don't pop out of place. All right, we're safe. Now we're going to bolt down our cool head. I'm using copper washers. Sometimes you'll have aluminum washers, or you might even have O-rings here. First, I'll tighten these down by hand, and then I will torque them to 20 foot-pounds, and I will generally go in a crisscross pattern, starting from the center, working my way outward. Now we're going to put our coolant tube in the back. It goes right between our two intakes and hooks up to this tube right here. I like to put just a little bit of dielectric on the inside of these. It just helps. It helps with installation for sliding these things on, and it also prevents them from getting stuck on here. So it just makes it easier to take them off later on down the road. We're going to slide our hose clamps on ahead of time. And we'll tighten down our hose clamps. These don't have to be crazy tight, just snug them up. I like to try to angle these so that it's easy to get a screwdriver in there to tighten them up or loosen them. Now we're going to put our reeds and our intake boots on. Now these are V-Force 4 reeds. These are aftermarket. You may have something different, like a Boyson V-Force 3 or even your OEM ones. So you may look a little bit different here, but it's going to be a similar installation. The other thing that may be different is you may have a little opening right here and a crossover tube that connects the tube intake boots. Now I'm not utilizing the crossover tube, so in this one you won't see that. These are just a plain old boot. The other thing you may have is a billet intake block, something like this, whereas this, you know, bolts on like so. So there's multiple different setups that you might see with the Banshee, but this will be for this is a UPP brand boot and the V-Force 4 reeds. So we're gonna have a gasket, reed cage, gasket, and then intake boot. So just like with my other gaskets, I'm gonna put a thin coat of grease on these. So here we go, I'm going to put these together. Gasket in front of the reed cage, gasket behind the reed cage, and then the intake boot on top. These take 8mm bolts, and there's a little bit of play in the hole if you line them up like that. So I use 1/4-20s, which are a little bit thicker, and these are going to locate and center these up. So I'll put these diagonally, and we can get these 8mm bolts tightened up. And then once these two are snugged down and everything is nice and aligned, you can feel there's no seams or anything, now we can come in and take these out. I'm just snugging these down. They really don't need to be too tight. Alright, thank you for watching this engine assembly video of the Yamaha Banshee. Now keep in mind, if you are doing this yourself, to take your time. I highly recommend getting a service manual and following the steps in there as well. You can use this video as a good reference. And also remember, there are lots of modifications done to this particular engine, so you may have some differences in your assembly. So if this video helped you out in any way, shape, or form, please consider leaving a comment below with your engine building experiences. Also consider giving the video a thumbs up. That does help out tremendously. If you want to see more content like this and builds like the Voodoo Banshee, please consider subscribing. And if you're looking to help out the channel even further, there is the option to join. This has been another engine building tutorial with Basket Case Garage. I'm Mike Sabo. I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.